The crying stopped the moment Jungkook touched the locked door. He froze in the silent hallway, staring at the thin line of light beneath it. "Jimin?" he whispered. No answer. Then came a quiet sound from inside, followed by a single sentence that made Jungkook's heart drop. "Please, don't ask me what happened." What was Jimin hiding behind that door, and why did he look terrified of letting Jungkook find out? The next morning, Jungkook woke before sunrise, but he did not leave his room. He sat on the edge of the bed with his phone in his hand, staring at the same unanswered message he had sent hours earlier. "Are you okay?" Jimin had seen it. Jungkook knew because the small notification had disappeared. But there had been no reply. That silence bothered him more than the crying itself. Jimin had always been good at hiding pain. He could smile while exhausted, joke when he was nervous, and change the subject whenever a conversation became too personal. But last night had been different. Jungkook had heard the uneven breathing through the door. He had heard something fall inside the room. And he had heard Jimin whisper a name that Jungkook could not clearly understand. The worst part was that when the door finally opened several minutes later, Jimin had looked completely different. His eyes were red. His face was pale. Yet he had forced a small smile and said, "I'm fine." Jungkook had wanted to believe him. He couldn't. Later that morning, Jungkook found Jimin alone in the kitchen. A cup of untouched coffee sat beside him. His fingers were wrapped around it, but he wasn't drinking. He was staring at the table as if he were trying to remember something he desperately wanted to forget. Jungkook stopped at the doorway. "You didn't sleep." Jimin's shoulders stiffened. "Neither did you. I asked you first." Jimin finally looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jimin smiled faintly. "It wasn't anything important." Jungkook walked closer. "Then why were you crying?" The smile disappeared. Jimin lowered his eyes. "I don't want to talk about it." "Okay." Jungkook said it quietly, but he didn't move away. "You don't have to tell me everything. Just tell me if you're safe." That question seemed to hurt more than the others. Jimin's fingers tightened around the cup. "I don't know." It was the first honest answer Jungkook had received. And it changed everything. He pulled out the chair across from Jimin and sat down. "What happened?" Jimin shook his head. "I said I don't want to talk about it. And I said you don't have to tell me everything." Jungkook paused. "But you just said you don't know if you're safe." Jimin looked toward the window. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. Cars moved along the street, people hurried to work, and the ordinary morning continued as if nothing had happened. But inside that quiet room, something had already broken. "Jungkook," Jimin whispered. "Sometimes knowing the truth doesn't make anything better." "Maybe." Jungkook leaned back. "But not knowing can be worse." Jimin didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small silver key. Jungkook immediately recognized it. It was the key to the storage room they rarely used. Jimin placed it on the table between them. "If you find something in there," he said, "don't assume it's what you think it is." Jungkook stared at the key. "Why are you giving this to me?" Jimin stood up. "Because I don't think I can keep looking at it." Then he walked away. Jungkook waited until he heard the bedroom door close before picking up the key. It was cold against his palm. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. He knew he should respect Jimin's request. He knew he shouldn't open a door that Jimin had clearly been afraid to open himself. But there was something about the way Jimin had said those words that made the key feel less like permission and more like a warning. The storage room was at the end of the hallway, behind a narrow wooden door that had remained closed for months. Jungkook stood in front of it that afternoon, holding the key between his fingers. He hesitated. Then he remembered Jimin's red eyes. He inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside, the room smelled of dust and old paper. A single window allowed a thin line of sunlight to fall across several boxes. Jungkook stepped inside carefully. He wasn't looking for secrets. He was looking for whatever had made Jimin cry. On the top shelf was an old cardboard box with Jimin's handwriting on it. Jungkook reached for it. The lid was already loose. Inside were photographs, folded papers, a small music player, and a white envelope. His hand stopped above the envelope. There was no name on the front. Only one sentence written in black ink. For the day you finally remember. Jungkook's breathing slowed. He opened it. Inside was a photograph of two younger versions of them standing beneath a street lamp in the rain. Jimin was smiling at the camera. Jungkook wasn't looking at the camera at all. He was looking at Jimin. Jungkook stared at the photograph for several seconds. He remembered the night. At least, he thought he did. They had been younger, exhausted, and returning from a late schedule. They had stopped beneath the street lamp because Jimin had forgotten his umbrella. But there was something missing from his memory. Something important. On the back of the photograph was another sentence. You promise you would never let him face it alone. Jungkook's hand began to tremble. He turned the photograph over again. There was no date. No explanation. Just those words. Then the music player inside the box suddenly caught his attention. A small red light blinked when he pressed the button. Static filled the room. Then a voice came through the speaker. It was Jimin's voice, younger and frightened. If you're hearing this, then I failed to tell you again. Jungkook froze. The recording continued. I wanted to tell you. I tried. But every time I looked at you, I was afraid that the truth would change everything. The recording stopped. Jungkook stared at the device in disbelief. There were no more words. Only silence. Then he noticed something beneath the photographs. A folded hospital document. His eyes moved across the page, and his expression changed. It wasn't Jimin's name that caught his attention. It was his own. Jungkook slowly unfolded the paper. He read the date. Then he read it again. His memory of that period had always been incomplete, but he had never questioned why. Now he realized there was a gap of several days he could not explain. And Jimin had been there. The thought hit him harder than the document itself. Jimin had known something about that time. Something Jungkook had forgotten. Something important enough to make him cry behind a locked door years later. Suddenly, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Jungkook quickly placed everything back inside the box. But before he could close the lid, he saw one final photograph underneath the papers. It showed Jimin sitting beside a hospital bed. His head was lowered. His hand was tightly holding someone else's hand. Jungkook couldn't see the face of the person in the bed. He turned the photograph over. There were only 4 words written on the back. He asked for you? The storage room door opened. Jimin stood there. His face went completely pale when he saw what Jungkook was holding. You weren't supposed to find that. For the first time, Jungkook saw fear in Jimin's eyes. Not fear of the past. Fear of what Jungkook might remember next. Jungkook did not move. The photograph remained between his fingers, and Jimin stood in the doorway as if crossing the threshold would somehow make the truth impossible to hide. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then Jimin's eyes dropped to the hospital document on the floor. His face tightened. Put it back, he whispered. Jungkook looked at him. Who was in that bed? Jimin swallowed hard. I said put it back. And I asked you a question? Jimin stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The click of the lock sounded strangely loud. You don't remember, he said. That's why I didn't tell you. Jungkook stared at him. Then help me remember. Jimin shook his head. No. The answer came too quickly. Why? Because if you remember everything, you might hate me. Jungkook's expression changed. Why would I hate you? Jimin looked away. His hands were shaking. Because I made a decision for you. That sentence stayed between them like a warning. Jungkook slowly placed the photograph back into the box. What decision? Jimin didn't answer. Instead, he walked past him and reached for the old music player. He turned it off and held it tightly against his chest. Forget you saw this. I can't. Please. Jimin. His voice softened. You cried behind a locked door last night. You gave me a key this morning. Now I find out that something happened to me, and you were there. How am I supposed to forget? Jimin closed his eyes. You're supposed to trust me. Jungkook almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. I do trust you. That's why this hurts. Jimin finally looked at him. Something in his expression broke. Then trust me enough to leave this alone. Jungkook wanted to argue. Instead, he stepped back. He could see that Jimin wasn't ready. But as they left the storage room, Jungkook noticed something on the floor near the box. A small folded note had slipped beneath the shelf. Jimin didn't see it. Jungkook did. He waited until Jimin walked ahead, then quietly picked it up. That night, he unfolded it beneath the dim light of his room. There were only 2 lines. He doesn't remember the promise. Don't make him remember the night. Jungkook read it twice. Then a 3rd time. Who had written it? And what had happened that night? The question followed him into sleep. But the answer arrived sooner than he expected. The next afternoon, Jungkook received a message from an unknown number. You opened the box. He stared at the screen. Another message appeared. Then you already know enough to stay away from Jimin. Jungkook immediately replied. Who are you? No response came. 5 minutes passed. Then another message arrived. Ask him why he never told you what happened at the hospital. Jungkook's chest tightened. He looked toward Jimin's room. The door was closed. For a moment, he considered confronting him immediately. Instead, he waited. When Jimin finally came out, Jungkook noticed that he was carrying a small black bag. Where are you going? Out. With who? Jimin hesitated. It doesn't matter. Jungkook stepped closer. Someone contacted me. Jimin froze. What did they say? That reaction told Jungkook everything. So you know who it is? Jimin's face lost its color. Delete the message. No, Jungkook, please. Tell me the truth. Jimin's eyes filled with fear. You don't understand what you're asking. Then explain it. Jimin looked down at the floor. I can't. He walked toward the door. Jungkook caught his wrist, but immediately loosened his grip when he saw Jimin flinch. I'm not trying to control you, he said quietly. I'm trying to understand why you're protecting me from something that happened to me. Jimin pulled his hand away. Because I promised. To whom? Jimin didn't answer. He left. Jungkook stood alone in the hallway, feeling the distance between them grow wider. Hours later, Jimin still hadn't returned. Jungkook called him once. No answer. Twice. Nothing. Then his phone vibrated. It was another message from the unknown number. This time, there was a photograph attached. Jungkook opened it and froze. It was an image of the same hospital hallway from the old photograph. But this picture had been taken from farther away. In the corner stood Jimin, younger, soaked from the rain. Beside him was another figure whose face had been deliberately blurred. Beneath the photograph was a sentence. He chose you over himself. Jungkook's hands went cold. He immediately called Jimin again. This time, someone answered. But it wasn't Jimin. Stop looking, a stranger said. Jungkook's voice hardened. Where is he? Silence. Where is Jimin? The line disconnected. Jungkook grabbed his jacket and rushed outside. He didn't know where Jimin had gone, but he knew one place connected to the photographs. The old hospital. By the time he arrived, rain had begun falling. The building looked almost exactly as it had in the photograph, except the hallway lights were brighter and the entrance was nearly empty. Jungkook walked inside and approached the reception desk. He gave Jimin's name. The receptionist checked the system and frowned. That record is restricted. Why? I can't tell you. Jungkook's stomach dropped. Then tell me if he came here today. The receptionist hesitated. Someone matching that name was here earlier. Where did he go? She looked toward the elevators. 3rd floor. Jungkook hurried upstairs. The corridor was silent. At the end was a small waiting area with several empty chairs. Jimin was sitting alone near the window. His shoulders were hunched, and his hands were clasped together. Jungkook stopped several feet away. "You came here." Jimin didn't look surprised. "I knew you'd follow." "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you here." Jungkook stepped closer. "What happened here?" Jimin looked at the rain outside. "This is where I learned that protecting someone can also become a way of hurting them." Jungkook sat beside him. "Who was in that bed?" Jimin's lips trembled. "You." Jungkook's breathing stopped. "What?" "You were the one in the bed." Jimin finally looked at him. "You had an accident. You survived, but there was a period you couldn't remember." Jungkook stared at him. "Why didn't I know?" "Because the doctors said remembering everything too quickly could make things worse." "And you decided what I should remember?" Jimin's eyes filled with tears. "I decided to let you heal." "Without telling me?" "You were terrified." "I deserve the truth." Jimin nodded slowly. "I know." The simple admission hurt more than an argument. Jungkook looked away. "What did I promise?" Jimin became silent. "Jimin! You promised you wouldn't leave me." Jungkook frowned. "I don't remember." "I know." Jimin's voice cracked. "That's what hurts." He reached into his bag and pulled out the old music player. "You said it the night before the accident." Jungkook stared at it. "Then why did I forget?" Jimin pressed the device into his palm. "Because you asked me to make sure you didn't remember the worst part." Jungkook's eyes widened. "I asked you?" Jimin nodded. "You were awake for only a few minutes. You knew something had happened. You knew you were afraid. And you told me that if remembering would destroy you, I should let you forget." Jungkook's fingers tightened around the device. "What was the worst part?" Jimin looked at him for a long time. "I was the reason you were there." The words landed with devastating silence. Jungkook stood up. "What does that mean?" Jimin couldn't answer. His tears finally fell. "I didn't hurt you," he whispered. "But I made a choice that put you in that car." Jungkook stepped back. Suddenly, every missing memory felt heavier. The hospital. The rain. The photograph. The promise. The locked door. None of it was random. And Jimin had been carrying the entire story alone. Before Jungkook could ask another question, his phone vibrated. A new message appeared. "He still hasn't told you the truth. Ask him who was driving." Jungkook slowly lifted his eyes toward Jimin. Jimin saw the message on his face and stopped breathing. For the first time, he didn't try to hide. He simply whispered, "Please don't ask me that." And Jungkook realized the question he had been chasing was no longer what happened to him. It was what Jimin had done on the night everything changed. The envelope was still on the table when Jimin finally returned to the apartment. He had spent the entire night trying to convince himself that what he had heard behind that locked door had been nothing more than a private moment of pain. But the envelope made that impossible. It was still there, exactly where Jungkook had left it, with Jimin's name written across the front in handwriting he recognized immediately. He stood beside the table for several seconds without touching it. Then his phone vibrated. One message appeared on the screen. "You need to stop asking Jungkook about the past." Jimin's face went cold. He read it again. There was no name. No explanation. Just one sentence. And somehow, it frightened him more than the sound of Jungkook crying. He looked toward Jungkook's closed bedroom door. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Earlier that morning, Jungkook had left without saying where he was going. He had barely looked at Jimin before walking out. That silence had been worse than an argument. For years, Jimin had believed that silence between them meant trust. Now he was beginning to understand that sometimes silence was where people buried the things they were most afraid to say. He picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. Inside was a small silver key and a photograph. Jimin stared at the photograph until his breathing changed. It showed the two of them standing outside an old rehearsal building years earlier. They were younger, exhausted, and laughing at something beyond the frame. Jungkook's arm was around Jimin's shoulder. Jimin remembered the day. He remembered the rain. He remembered Jungkook giving him his jacket because Jimin had forgotten his own. But there was something written on the back. A date. And beneath it 4 words. "Promise me you won't forget." Jimin slowly sat down. He knew that date. It was the day everything between them had changed. The day Jungkook had first disappeared from his life for 3 weeks. The day Jimin had never understood. For years, he had assumed Jungkook simply needed space. Later, he had accepted the explanation that family problems had forced him away. But the photograph suggested something else. Something neither of them had ever spoken about. The key was cold in his palm. Then his phone rang. Jimin almost dropped it. It was Jungkook. For a moment, he could not answer. Finally, he pressed the screen. "Where are you?" Silence. "Jungkook?" A breath came through the speaker. Then Jungkook said quietly, "Did you open the envelope?" Jimin froze. "How did you know?" Another silence. "I told you not to look for answers. You left me a key." "I know." "Why?" Jungkook's voice became almost a whisper. "Because I don't think I can keep protecting you from it." The call ended. Jimin stared at the screen. "Protecting me from what?" He looked again at the photograph. Suddenly, the old memories began returning in fragments. A hospital hallway. Jungkook standing alone beneath a flickering light. A suitcase beside his feet. Jimin calling his name. And a sentence Jungkook had said before walking away. "Someday, you'll understand why I had to leave." At the time, Jimin had thought it was an excuse. Now he wondered if it had been a warning. The silver key suddenly felt much heavier. He turned it over in his fingers. A tiny number had been engraved on it. Jimin knew exactly where that key belonged. There was an old storage room beneath the rehearsal building they had stopped using years ago. Room 17. Nobody went there anymore. At least, that was what Jungkook had always told him. Jimin stood up. He took his coat from the chair. Before leaving, he looked once more at Jungkook's bedroom door. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. There was no answer. Only silence. And somewhere deep inside him, Jimin already knew that whatever waited behind room 17 would change the meaning of every painful memory they had shared. When he reached the old building, evening had already settled over the city. The corridors smelled of dust and rain. His footsteps echoed against the empty walls as he walked toward the basement. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked. Jimin pushed the door open. Inside was almost nothing. An old chair. A broken mirror. Several cardboard boxes. And a small black recorder sitting in the center of the floor. Jimin stared at it. There was a note beside it. His hands trembled as he picked it up. "Listen before you judge him." Jimin swallowed hard. He pressed the button. Static filled the room. Then Jungkook's voice came through. But it was younger. Much younger. "I don't know if Jimin will ever forgive me." Jimin stopped breathing. The recording continued. "I know he thinks I abandoned him. I know he thinks I chose to leave. But that's not what happened." Jimin slowly sat on the old chair. The voice continued. "I left because someone told me that if I stayed, Jimin would pay the price." The recorder clicked. Silence. Then another voice appeared. A voice Jimin did not recognize. "You have one choice. Walk away from him, or watch him lose everything." Jimin's fingers tightened around the recorder. The recording ended. For several seconds he could not move. Then his phone vibrated again. This time, there was a photograph attached. It showed Jungkook standing outside a hospital. Beside him was the same person whose voice Jimin had just heard. And beneath the photograph was one sentence. "You were never supposed to find this." Jimin looked at the dark screen. Then toward the locked storage room. For the first time, he understood that Jungkook's tears had never been about something that happened recently. They had been about something that began years ago. Something Jungkook had sacrificed himself to hide. And now that secret was finally coming back for both of them. Jimin stayed inside room 17 long after the recording had ended, staring at the black recorder in his hand as if it might suddenly explain everything. The rain outside grew heavier, striking the basement windows in rapid bursts. He replayed Jungkook's voice again. "I left because someone told me that if I stayed, Jimin would pay the price." The sentence sounded different now. Not like an excuse. Not like abandonment. Like fear. But if Jungkook had been protecting him, why had he allowed Jimin to spend years believing he had simply chosen to walk away? And who had been powerful enough to make Jungkook believe leaving was the only way to keep Jimin safe? His phone vibrated once more. This time there was no photograph. Only a location. An empty parking garage across the city. No message. No name. Jimin should have stayed away. Every instinct told him that this was becoming dangerous, that someone was deliberately pulling him deeper into a secret Jungkook had spent years trying to bury. But then he looked at the photograph from the envelope again. Two younger versions of themselves were smiling without fear, unaware of the years of silence waiting ahead. Jimin slipped the photograph into his pocket and left room 17. The parking garage was nearly empty when he arrived. Fluorescent lights flickered above rows of parked cars. His footsteps echoed between the concrete walls. He walked slowly, checking every shadow. Then he saw someone standing near a dark vehicle. It was Jungkook. Jimin stopped. For several seconds neither of them moved. Jungkook looked exhausted. His hair was damp from the rain, his jacket hanging loosely from his shoulders. But what struck Jimin most was his expression. There was no anger in it. Only resignation. "You shouldn't have come," Jungkook said. "You shouldn't have lied." Jungkook looked away. "I didn't lie about everything. You lied about why you left. I thought I had no choice." "You always had a choice." That sentence hit harder than Jimin expected. Jungkook lowered his eyes. "You're right." The silence between them became unbearable. Jimin stepped closer. "Who was that person?" Jungkook didn't answer. "Who threatened you?" Still nothing. "Was it because of me?" Jungkook finally looked at him. "Yes." Jimin's expression changed. The answer was too simple. Too painful. "Then tell me what happened." Jungkook shook his head. "If I tell you, you might hate me. I already hated you for leaving." That made Jungkook flinch. Jimin immediately regretted saying it, but he refused to take it back. "You let me believe I wasn't important enough for you to stay. I left because you were too important." Jimin's eyes filled with tears. "Then why didn't you come back?" Jungkook's jaw tightened. "Because the threat didn't end when I left." "What threat?" Jungkook looked toward the entrance of the garage. "Someone knew where you lived. They knew your schedule. They knew everything about us." Jimin's breathing became shallow. "Who?" "But you knew what they wanted." Jungkook nodded. "They wanted me to disappear from your life." "Why?" "Because they believed you were the one person who could make me refuse them." Jimin stared at him. "What did they want from you?" Jungkook didn't answer immediately. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Jimin. It was an old contract. Jimin scanned the first page and frowned. This is my agreement to leave. Jimin looked up. What? They gave me two choices. Walk away from you permanently, or cooperate with them. What were you supposed to cooperate with? Jungkook's voice became quiet. I was supposed to take responsibility for something I didn't do. Jimin's eyes narrowed. What? A financial crime. The words seemed almost absurd. But the document in Jimin's hand was real. Names. Dates. Signatures. Everything had been arranged to make Jungkook appear responsible. Jimin turned another page. Then he saw his own name. His fingers went numb. Why is my name here? Jungkook closed his eyes. Because they needed someone to blame if I refused. Jimin looked up sharply. So you protected me by becoming the villain? I didn't know what else to do. You could have told me. They said they would destroy you. You should have trusted me. I was terrified. The words exploded from Jungkook. The garage went silent. His chest rose and fell rapidly. I was terrified that one wrong decision would ruin your life, he said. Every day I told myself that if you hated me, at least you would be alive and free. Jimin stared at him. You don't get to decide what I'm willing to lose. Jungkook looked down. I know. A tear slipped down his cheek. Jimin had seen Jungkook cry before. But never like this. There was no anger in it. No attempt to hide. Only years of exhaustion finally breaking through. Jimin wanted to reach for him. He didn't. Not yet. You should have told me, he whispered. I know. You should have trusted me. I know. You made me believe I wasn't worth fighting for. Jungkook's eyes closed. That is the part one regret most. The rain continued outside. For the first time in years, either of them tried to escape the silence. Then Jimin remembered the recorder. There was another voice. Jungkook's expression immediately changed. Where did you find it? Room 17. Jungkook stepped backward. You went there? Yes. You shouldn't have. Why? Because that's where I kept everything I couldn't destroy. Jimin pulled the photograph from his pocket. Jungkook stared at it. For a moment, he looked terrified. Then he whispered, He was the person who gave me the choice. Who is he? Jungkook looked directly into Jimin's eyes. My father. Jimin froze. The revelation explained something. But not everything. Because Jungkook's father had supposedly been absent from their lives for years. Jimin had never met him. And according to Jungkook, he had died long before the events of their separation. So he was alive? He was. Then why did you tell everyone he was dead? Because he wanted it that way. Jimin stared at him. Why? Jungkook took a shaky breath. Because disappearing was the only way he could protect himself from the people he worked with. Jimin felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. But one question remained. If your father was the one threatening you, why are you still protecting him? Jungkook didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the silver key. The same key Jimin had found in the envelope. You asked what this opens? Jimin nodded. It doesn't open room 17. Jungkook placed the key in Jimin's palm. It opens a box. What box? The one my father left behind. Jimin stared at the key. Where is it? Jungkook looked toward the dark garage entrance. Somewhere he knew you'd eventually find it. Jimin's heart sank. What does that mean? Jungkook's voice was barely audible. He didn't leave it for me. He looked at Jimin. He left it for you. The world seemed to stop. Jimin stared at the key. For years, he had believed he was the person Jungkook had been protecting. Now he realized something much more frightening. Perhaps he had been part of the plan from the beginning. Jungkook stepped closer. There's something else you need to know. What? The night I left you. He stopped. Jimin waited. Jungkook's eyes filled with tears again. I wasn't running away from you. Then what were you running toward? Jungkook swallowed. I was going to meet the person who could finally prove I was innocent. Jimin's heart raced. Did you find them? Jungkook looked at him. Yes. Who? Jungkook's answer was almost a whisper. You. Jimin couldn't understand. What? Jungkook reached into his pocket and pulled out another photograph. This one was newer. It showed Jimin standing outside a hospital several years earlier. But he had no memory of ever being there. On the back was a date. The same date from the first photograph. And beneath it, another sentence. You already knew the truth. You just don't remember. Jimin's hand began to tremble. He looked at Jungkook. What happened to me that night? Jungkook said nothing. And that silence told Jimin that the truth was far worse than he had imagined. Jimin could barely hear the rain anymore. The photograph trembled between his fingers as he stared at the date written on its back. It was the same date as the photograph from room 17, the same night Jungkook had disappeared from his life, the same night Jimin had spent years remembering as a painful blur. But now there was a hospital in the picture, and Jimin was standing outside it. He looked pale, exhausted, almost frightened. Jungkook stood several steps behind him, watching him with an expression Jimin had never seen before. What happened to me that night? Jimin asked again. Jungkook didn't answer immediately. He looked as if he were fighting with himself. Then he whispered, You were in that hospital because of me. Jimin's face went still. What do you mean? You found out about the people threatening me. You tried to confront them yourself. I don't remember that. I know. Jungkook looked down. That's why I left. Jimin stepped closer. Tell me everything. Jungkook took a slow breath. That night you followed me. You didn't tell me where you were going. You just showed up. A faint memory moved through Jimin's mind. A dark street. Headlights. Jungkook shouting his name. Then nothing. You saw the meeting. Jungkook continued. You saw the documents. You realized the accusation against me had been fabricated. And then someone noticed you. Jimin's breathing became unsteady. What happened? There was an accident. The words came slowly. You were injured. Not seriously enough to die, but badly enough that the doctors were worried about your memory. Jimin touched the side of his head instinctively. My memory, you remembered pieces. But not the entire night. Jungkook's eyes filled with tears. When you woke up, you asked for me. Jimin stared at him. What did you say? You asked where I was? Jungkook looked away. And I was standing outside the room. Why didn't you come in? Because someone had already warned me. They told me that if I came near you again, the evidence would disappear and you would become their next target. Jimin closed his eyes. Suddenly, the locked door from earlier seemed to exist again in his mind. Jungkook crying behind it. Refusing to explain. Protecting something that had been hurting him for years. So you left me believing you didn't care? Jimin whispered. Yes. You let me hate you. Yes. You watched me suffer. Jungkook's voice broke. Every single day. Jimin's anger finally collapsed under the weight of the truth. He turned away, pressing one hand against his mouth. He didn't want Jungkook to see him cry. But Jungkook already knew. He always knew. Why now? Jimin asked. Why tell me now? Jungkook reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Because the person who threatened us is gone. Jimin turned around. Gone? He disappeared 2 weeks ago. The investigation finally uncovered the records he had hidden. Jungkook opened a file on the screen. There were copies of documents, photographs, and messages. Jimin looked at them one by one. The fabricated contract. The hospital records. The old threats. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A message from the night of the accident. It had been sent to Jungkook. If you love him, make him forget you. Jimin stared at the words. That was the choice? Yes. Jungkook's voice was almost silent. They knew you were the one person I couldn't sacrifice. Jimin looked at him. And you thought leaving was sacrificing yourself? I thought it was. But it wasn't. Jungkook shook his head. No. It was sacrificing both of us. That sentence stayed between them. Neither moved. The truth had finally arrived, but it did not repair the years that had been lost. Jimin still remembered waking up alone. He remembered calling Jungkook. He remembered receiving nothing. He remembered convincing himself that he had imagined their closeness. Those memories were still real, even if the reason behind them had changed. I understand why you left, Jimin said. But understanding doesn't erase what it did to me. Jungkook nodded. I don't expect it to. Jimin looked at him. Good. His voice shook. Because I don't know how to forgive you yet. Jungkook wiped his face. You don't have to. For the first time, Jimin saw something different in his expression. Not desperation. Acceptance. He wasn't asking Jimin to forget. He was finally allowing him to feel everything he had been denied. Then Jimin remembered the silver key. The box. Jungkook nodded. We need to find it. They drove to an old building on the edge of the city. Jungkook didn't explain where they were going. The silence inside the car felt different now. It was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence of two people standing beside a truth neither knew how to touch. When they arrived, Jungkook led Jimin down a narrow corridor to a small room hidden behind an old storage area. There was a metal cabinet against the wall. Jimin inserted the silver key. The lock opened. Inside was a single wooden box. No documents. No money. No weapons. Just a small cassette recorder, another photograph, and a handwritten letter. Jimin picked up the letter. His name was written across the front. His hands immediately became cold. He opened it. The handwriting belonged to Jungkook's father. The first sentence stopped him. If you are reading this, then Jungkook finally told you the truth. Jimin read on. The letter explained that the entire scheme had been created to control Jungkook. His father's business partners had discovered how deeply Jungkook cared about Jimin and decided to use that relationship against him. But there was another secret. The accident had not been planned. The threat had been. And the person who had helped arrange the false evidence had eventually regretted what he had done. That person had been the anonymous voice from the recording. He had left behind evidence before disappearing. Jimin turned the page. Near the bottom was a sentence that made his heart stop. Jimin, Jungkook did not leave because he stopped loving you. He left because he believed love made you vulnerable. Jimin slowly lowered the letter. Jungkook stood across from him, unable to meet his eyes. You knew about this? Jimin asked. Not everything. Then why did you hide the box? Because I was afraid of what you'd find. Jimin stepped closer. You were afraid I'd learn that you loved me? Jungkook looked up. His eyes were wet. I was afraid you'd learn that I never stopped. Jimin's expression broke. For years, both of them had been trapped inside the same misunderstanding. Jimin thought Jungkook had abandoned him. Jungkook thought protecting Jimin required becoming someone Jimin could hate. Neither had understood that the distance itself was becoming the wound. Jimin sat down on the floor beside the box. Do you know what hurt the most? Jungkook slowly sat opposite him. What? Not that you left. Jimin looked at him. It was that I thought you had chosen a life without me. Jungkook's eyes filled again. I never did. Then say it now. Jungkook hesitated. What? Say what you couldn't say back then. The room became completely silent. Jungkook looked directly at him. I loved you. I was terrified of losing you. And I made the worst decision of my life because I thought disappearing would keep you safe. Jimin's tears finally fell. He didn't wipe them away. You should have trusted me enough to let me choose too. I know. You should have let me fight beside you. I know. And you should have come back sooner. Jungkook's voice cracked. I wanted to. Then why didn't you? Jungkook looked toward the box. Because after the accident, you forgot part of that night. I was afraid that if I came back, I'd bring everything back with me. Jimin looked down at the letter. Maybe I needed the truth. I know that now. Jimin reached for the photograph inside the box. It showed them sitting on the floor of the old rehearsal room, sharing a pair of headphones. On the back was the same phrase that had appeared before. Promise me you won't forget. Jimin smiled sadly. You kept this all these years. I couldn't throw it away. Neither could I. Jungkook looked at him. You kept the other half? Jimin frowned. Other half? Jungkook pointed toward the photograph. Look closer. Jimin turned it over. There was a tiny mark near the corner. He remembered suddenly. Years ago, they had made a private promise. Whenever one of them was afraid, they would leave a small silver mark somewhere only the other could find. It had started as a silly game. But after the accident, the room became completely still after the recording stopped. Jimin could hear his own breathing. Jungkook was still holding the recorder, staring at it as if he could force the voice to continue. For years, they had believed the nightmare began with Jungkook's father. Now they understood that he had only been one piece of something much larger. But there was one detail that refused to leave Jimin's mind. Someone made me forget one specific memory, he whispered. Jungkook looked at him. What memory? Jimin shook his head. I don't know. Then, without warning, a fragment returned. A hospital room. A white curtain moving in the air. Jungkook standing beside the bed. And a woman's voice saying, he must never remember who brought him here. Jimin gripped the edge of the table. I remember something. Jungkook immediately moved closer. What? A voice. Whose? I don't know. Jimin closed his eyes, trying to hold on to the memory before it disappeared again. She said someone brought me to the hospital. Jungkook went silent. Then he remembered something of his own. I wasn't the one who brought you there. Jimin opened his eyes. What? When the accident happened, I was already being taken away. I didn't reach the hospital until later. The two of them stared at each other. That meant someone else had found Jimin first. Someone who had been there before Jungkook. Someone who knew what had happened. They searched through the documents in the box again. This time, Jimin noticed a small hospital identification bracelet tucked beneath the bottom of the wooden compartment. His name was printed on it, along with the time. He looked at the time and then at Jungkook. This was before you arrived. Jungkook nodded slowly. Then whoever brought you there knew exactly what had happened. Jimin turned the bracelet over. On the back was a handwritten number. Not a room number. A phone number. Jungkook immediately recognized the first few digits. That's an old emergency line. Whose? The private security office my family used. Jimin stared at him. So someone from your family found me? Jungkook shook his head. Not necessarily. He took out his phone and searched the number. The result appeared almost immediately. It belonged to an emergency transport service that had been hired that night by a person whose identity had been hidden under a private account. But there was one piece of information attached to the payment record. A name. Jimin stared at it. That can't be right. Jungkook's face had gone pale. The name belonged to someone they both trusted during those years. Someone who had been present after the accident. Someone who had spent years telling them that the past was better left buried. But the deeper they looked, the clearer the truth became. That person had not caused the accident. They had made a desperate decision afterward. They had been afraid that if Jimin remembered the entire night, he would discover that Jungkook had been framed. So they had accepted the threat and helped hide the truth. Not because they hated either of them, but because they believed silence was the only way to keep them alive. It did not excuse what they had done. It only explained why the secret had survived for so long. Jimin closed his eyes. Everyone kept deciding what was best for me. Jungkook lowered his head. Including me. Especially you. There was pain in his voice, but no hatred anymore. That was the difference. Jimin no longer wanted to punish Jungkook for the past. He wanted to stop living inside it. They returned to the apartment before sunrise. Either of them spoke much during the drive. The city was slowly waking up outside the windows. Streetlights disappeared one by one as the sky became brighter. When they entered the apartment, Jimin walked straight to his room. He stopped at the door. The same door behind which he had once cried without understanding why. The same door where Jungkook had stood outside, hearing his pain but being unable to enter. Jimin touched the handle. Then he opened it. Jungkook stood in the hallway. You can come in, Jimin said. Jungkook hesitated. Are you sure? Jimin looked at him. This time, don't decide for me. Jungkook nodded and entered. They sat on the floor beside the bed. No documents. No recordings. No hidden messages. Just silence. After everything they had uncovered, that simple silence felt almost peaceful. Do you remember the promise? Jungkook asked. Jimin looked at him. Which one? The one about the silver mark. Jimin smiled faintly. I remember now. Jungkook reached into his pocket and placed the old silver key on the floor between them. I kept it because I thought one day it would lead us back here. Jimin picked it up. It led us to the truth. Jungkook shook his head. No. It led us back to each other. Jimin looked down at the key. For years, he had believed objects carried memories. Now he understood that people did too. A photograph could preserve a smile. A letter could preserve an apology. A key could preserve a promise. But none of them could repair the years that had been lost. Only the people themselves could do that. I'm not going to pretend everything is okay, Jimin said. I don't want you to. There will be days when I remember everything and get angry again. Then be angry. There will be days when I don't trust you. Jungkook nodded. Then I'll earn it again. Jimin finally looked at him. You really mean that? I do. There was no grand declaration.